So for everyone that is currently watching, welcome to this live streaming for the World Schools format coaching that I'm going to be providing for the Polish Schools Nationals Debating Championships. I hope everyone has had an opportunity to try fill out the form. I noticed there were only a couple of questions, but if you have any questions, please feel free to share them with me. I'll answer them as best as I can. In terms of this workshop, what I'm going to focus on is four main things. So the first thing is about, what is strategy. The second thing then looks at what is case construction. The third thing then looks at argument development and argument, organization. And then the fourth thing is mainly about how does strategy interact with other forms of debating, or rather other components of the format. So how does strategy interact with content, and how does strategy interact with style in particular? And then afterwards, I'll do questions and answers, where I'll answer the questions which I did receive in the form. And if you've got any other questions that you might have, you're more than welcome to share them with me. So first things first, obviously this is a World Schools tournament, so I need to just briefly go over the format itself. There are two teams. Each team has 3 speakers on it. Each of those speakers would be expected to deliver a 8-minute speech, and then either the first speaker or the second speaker on either of those teams would be expected to deliver a 4-minute reply speech after that speech, or after the 6 main speeches. The team that supports the topic is called the proposition. A team that opposes the topic is called the opposition. And the speakers then scored according to a very rigorous rubric, where we've got 3 categories. That is content, style, and strategy. Content counts 40% of the mark, style counts 40% of the mark, and strategy counts 20% of the mark. Content is about the material that is produced. How strong is it logically? Is it sound? Are there examples which are presented to support that material? Style is about how is it presented. So it looks at things such as tone, emotiveness, speed at which people are talking. It also looks at hand gestures, eye contact. So there's both very oral, verbal components of it, and also very visual components to it. And finally, strategy is about the how. It is about what was the choice and selection of arguments, the prioritization, the management of time, and so on. So hopefully that gives you a relatively solid background in terms of understanding the 3 categories that we have for World Schools format. I'm going to focus, as I've mentioned, on strategy for now, but strategy is heavily interlinked with the other components as well. So please feel free to ask me any questions, and I'll be more than happy to assist you along the way. Okay, great. So understanding strategy is really important for schools, because really you are explicitly assessed on your ability to understand what is important in the debate format. So strategy primarily deals with the why. So why are your arguments relevant to the debate? Why have you chosen to frame the debate in a particular way? And so it looks at, the interpretation of the motion. It looks at how you have managed your time, not only within your speech, but across all the speeches. It looks at how structured the speech was and where you've chosen to prioritize arguments. And finally, it looks at the consistency between arguments and between speeches. Okay, so obviously this is things which are intuitive, particularly for people who have done a British parliamentary format of debating. I guess the difference is in terms of relative weighing to the other components of the rubric, which are content and style. So what are the main things that you're going to be practicing or looking at when you're doing a strategy? I think the first thing is about issues themselves. So it is about, have you understood the motion? Have you understood your burden? Have you understood the issues themselves? And also, have you been able to answer the pertinent questions to the debate itself? And have you been able to respond to the pertinent questions in the debate itself? Because strategy is not just, I guess, a argumentative thing, it's also a responsive thing about how you respond to arguments and which arguments you choose to respond to. I think the second component of strategy, which is also important, is about organization itself. And this is something which I think is a bit unique towards schools, is that it's explicit in our understanding of strategy, is about, was your speech structured? Did you make sure the arguments were clearly packaged? Did you have a clear beginning to your speech? Did you follow through with very clear structure in terms of the ordering of issues? Did you follow with very clear structure in terms of the organization? And did you then have a conclusion to your speech? I think the other thing is about timing itself. So were you able to use the 8 minutes or 4 minutes that have been allocated to you? Did you assign the appropriate amount of time to each issue? So did you spend 6 minutes on a policy at the detriment of only doing 2 minutes of substantive material in the first proposition speech? So those are some of the things that we then consider. Okay, so then what would good strategy look like in general? It means that you've got very clear structure. It means that you clearly have an introduction to your speech. You're able to follow it through with good framing of the speech itself, and then enter into things such as if you are a responsive speaker, which is op 1 right up until op 3, you're following it with rebuttal. If you're a P1, it is policy, it's definition, is it there, is it clear to follow? And then it's also, then do I go into my substantive material and have a good conclusion? The other thing is about how you've managed your time. Am I allocating time appropriately to each issue? And am I also choosing to prioritize each issue accordingly? So do I spend 4 minutes on the most important argument, or do I just spend 30 minutes on 30 seconds on what is clearly the most crucial part of my argument? Then there's obviously things about consistency and refutation. So you shouldn't contradict your own arguments. You shouldn't contradict your teammates' arguments. And then you shouldn't argue. You should argue the case that you've been provided by a team. And then, are you able to effectively compare and contrast yourself to other teams? Okay. So yeah, that's strategy. That's strategy in summary, basically. So then the first thing that I think is important, and oops, lighting is not great for me, is understanding case construction. And this is an issue of strategy, but equally so it's an issue of, I think it's an important issue for content and style. So in order to do that, you would need to understand what are the different types of motions that you're going to be getting once you arrive at a debating competition. And then the type of motion is likely to be the thing that informs how you choose to construct and build your case from then on. So let's start with the motion types. Broadly, there are two types of motions. The first one is what is called a change debate or an imperative motion. In those instances, what you are expected to do is talk about a change that must occur in how the world currently works. So people will usually say that the motion that you'll hear is this house would. I am personally very much against having a very linear or very rigid stance on it. If the motion suggests that you change the way in which the world works currently, then you would treat it as a change debate. And so typically it is the this house would wording. So for example, this house would abolish cosmetic surgery. This house would raise the legal drinking age. This house would force students to wear school uniforms. This house would use racial profiling in fighting against crime. So all of those are examples of change motions. The second type of topic that you're going to get is normative. So there, what you're really arguing is about a certain set of principles, morals, or values. And so typically you will hear people talk about this house regrets, this house believes that, or this house supports. And a wording which is becoming increasingly popular these days is this house prefers. So in those instances, it's not necessarily about explaining a change in the way in which the world works. It's about explaining whether something is good or bad, or if it is necessarily better when you're weighing up or comparing two possible alternatives. So those are the two motion types. Now, because you've got two different motion types, that also then means that there are different expectations of people within each of those motion types, because they require very different things. So let's talk about a change debate. If you are changing the way in which the world works, so let's say you are sitting in Parliament, you are a member of a Parliament or Congress or some kind of governing body, and you are making changes to it, the way in which the world works. You need to justify why you would make those changes. And I think similarly, so you need to think about that kind of thing in a debate. So then that imposes specific things that you must prove in order for people to be invested or interested in you making these changes. So the question then becomes, what are those things? And so in a change debate, the first thing that a proposing team needs to do is to prove that there's a problem that requires solving. So that's basically telling you, why are we having this discussion in the first place? If there's no problem worth solving, then it's less likely that judges will find it palatable or persuasive that you would want to invest in creating some sort of change. The second thing is that you then need to talk about, given that there's a problem, talk about how is it that you plan on solving this problem. So in this case, the usual word or the vocabulary that is used around this is either a policy or a model. How do you plan on doing this? In the World Schools format, it is not mandatory to provide a model, but often it is encouraged, especially in instances where we aren't sure of how we're going to be doing this. So a model is encouraged. Then the third thing is about, how does the model or this change in policy necessarily affect the harm? And so in those instances, you need to talk about the fact that the effect itself will be positive, and so either it prevents, mitigates, or fixes the harm, basically. That's what you would want to focus on. And then the final thing that you would want to focus on is about, are there any secondary effects outside of simply solving the problem which occur? And let me move around. Hopefully this lighting will fix itself. So are there any secondary effects that we need to consider that don't impact on our harm or make it worse, and are generally benefits that we get in addition to this? So that's a change debate from the proposition team. If you're looking at a change or an imperative motion on the side of opposition, you've got a number of options that you can follow. 3 general strategies that can be followed are the following. Firstly, an op team could say, well, we don't believe in the existence of the harm itself. We don't think there's a problem that requires solving in the first place. Obviously, that is a bit tricky because often motions are set with the intent that there's a issue worth talking about in the first place. So it's a tricky strategy, and it should be used cautiously. So if you can prove that certainly there is no problem with solving, then that's fine. The second strategy that you could say is, we concede that there is a problem that requires solving, but there is a better way to solve it. That then implies, if there's a better way to solve it, you've got one of 2 options. You could either provide a very clear counter model, or you could say that there's a possible set of alternatives that exist, and then describe what that possible set of alternatives looks like. But in either of those cases, what it imposes a secondary burden, implicit burden, and that is, how is it that your alternative necessarily makes the problem better? So there you've imposed a secondary burden of, not only do you have to show why this model on the side of proposition is not good or is not effective, but you also then need to show why it is that your model is necessarily good or effective in those regards. The third strategy is, you could say, we agree with the problem, we agree that the problem might solve, or the model might solve the problem, but there are significant harms associated with this change or with this policy, and you have to go into the effect of those. You can use these 3 strategies in combination with each other, but then the framing then becomes really important. You can't just say, well, we don't think there's a problem, and we agree that there's a problem, but it does more harm than benefit. I think in the way you need to frame this outline is, you would say, we agree, we disagree with the existence of the problem in the first place, but even if proposition successfully proves that there is in fact a problem worth showing, then we would tell you that there are far more harms than benefits that would be accrued. So there you're showing very clearly that even if they have successfully won that particular clash, here's why it's bad. And sometimes you can lose one clash but win others, and that's really important. And I think a lot of the time in BP, this is, for those who have a lot of experience with BP, this is when judges say you need to take a team at their best. So in this instance, you're conceding, yeah, there's a problem worth solving, but even at their best, here are some harms that are associated with it. I would strongly discourage using all three strategies because it overburdens you, and you're always playing this like game of even if, but, and shifting between them. So use two of them maximum, and I would say always use there are significant harms associated with the policy in combination with one of the other two strategies. And for those of you who do BP debating, this would also be something that's really useful for that. So now we've got some, I guess, understanding of change debates. Let's look at the second type of motion, which is your normative debate. Now, normative debates can take various different forms, but in general, you're talking about the morals, or whether something is good or bad, and you're not necessarily talking about whether or not it fixes a problem. So in those instances, the proposition team needs to do four things. One is to identify what are the issues at play. Now, sometimes there is an overlap between normative and imperative type debates. So for example, this house believes that governments ought to sanction countries with homophobic laws. In those instances, what is happening very clearly is that there's in part an imperative or a change part to that motion. So you're necessarily saying, we think that governments ought to do this. There's an implicit policy change, but you aren't necessarily arguing for it from a change framing. You're saying whether or not governments ought to do this. Is this a good thing? And so in those instances, you need to identify what issues are at play. You might be talking about, well, homophobia is a really bad thing, and so it lends itself to problem establishment. The second thing that you would then need to do is establish a value metric. And usually, when you are establishing a value metric, what you ought to be doing is establishing criteria or by which the debate ought to be evaluated by. So, for example, let's say the motion is this house believes that strike action during economic crisis does more harm than good. So in those instances, what you are trying to do is you need to establish a metric of when is how to evaluate the more harm than good. So in those instances, you would talk about your value metric is, does it disrupt way of life? Secondly, does it achieve the outcomes of the striking? The third thing is talking about secondary harms. So here are the three criteria, the three things that, or values that we have for the debate, and this is how the debate ought to be assessed. So that's the value metric in essence. The third thing that you would then need to do as an opposition or a proposition, is to then measure your side or your arguments against those three values or four values or the value metric you've established. And then at the end, you need to prove that you've achieved that metric. Okay, so that is the prop team or the prop burden in normative type debates. The opposition needs to do the following. They can choose to, again, accept or reject the issues which are important in the debate. Then the second thing is they can choose to either accept the value metric as provided by proposition, or they can add to it, so expand to it and say, yes, we think those three criteria are the important things to consider, but there is a fourth thing that needs consideration. Or they could outright reject that value metric and say, those are not the ways by which we assess this policy or outcome or this moral. It's more about these other three things. But naturally, that also imposes a secondary burden where teams now need to argue why that is the correct metric and not simply say that theirs is better. And then finally, explain why opposition arguments meet the metric, but proposition arguments do not meet that particular metric. Okay, so please, yeah, that's the way in which you deal with those kinds of things. If you've got any questions so far, please do feel free to ask me. Post a comment there. I am looking at them. There have been some very positive comments, a couple of positive comments, but feel free to interject with any questions. Okay, now we've got our two main, I think, burdens or ways in which we ought to be approaching debates and understanding it. I think the next thing then becomes what to do in the instance of what is called a dual or a double burden. Now, a lot of the motions we spoke, I've given examples. For example, would ban or abolish cosmetic surgery are all single burden. But I think sometimes motions are very specific. So they've been narrowed down to a particular context. So for example, this House believes that strike action does more harm than good during times of economic crisis. The primary framing of that motion is whether or not strike action does more harm than good. But then you need to consider that there's a secondary tier to that motion where you have to talk about it in times of economic crisis. So in those instances, you might need, what you would probably do is establish the first part or the main part of the criteria or the main part of the motion and what is needed from it. And then you use the secondary part where it's been narrowed down to a particular context or framing to then filter out what is important and what you would reasonably have to leave out, because there are often things which are not universally applied. Okay, so that deals with some basics in terms of understanding burdens, and that's useful in terms of case construction. I think the next thing then becomes, how do you then proceed from here during prep time when you are preparing a case? And so in those instances, it's all about framing and how you choose to frame it so that it's really persuasive. So in terms of problem solution debates, I think the first, or change debates or imperative debates, I think the first thing that you would need to do, at least in terms of the problem, is do three things. The first thing is make the problem seem significant and something that we ought to care about. So a lot of people talk about using emotive or evocative language in those instances. And I think this is where things like reading is really important, just reading in general, because the language that you use necessarily changes how you perceive that thing. So for example, if you just talk about how things are really bad in Venezuela, for example, that's very vague. And so the language that you'd want to talk about is people are starving. People have to resort to the most dehumanizing means of providing themselves with nutrition, such as eating rotten food. There, you make me care about it. If you just say things are bad in Venezuela, why should I care that much? I have no reason to. I think the second thing is that there's a clear trend that needs correction. So there's a pattern that is occurring that requires fixing. And then I think the third thing is, why is it pertinent to act now? Where is the urgency? So that then becomes a sort of three things that you then follow. Then once you've done that, what you would want to do is talk about the model. And so the three things you need to talk about are the details. And I think the easy way to sort out details is who does it, basically, who's responsible for acting. Then, how will they act? The next thing is, what are they acting against? What tools are they using? And finally, who are they acting against? So asking really important questions will allow you to establish detail of scope. Then the second thing that's really important, I think, with regards to that is, again, is relates to the first thing, is about the scope. So where does this policy apply? Are there any exceptions? Do you think that there is a particular group of actors who should not be acted upon? So for example, if you're talking about the cosmetic surgery debate, I think you would have to talk about people of all ages. If you are talking about, for example, school uniforms, you're talking about kids in school, and that sort of thing. So you have to be really careful about that sort of thing when you're dealing with your policies. Okay. So I think that covers the most part of, I think, just broader general case construction, how you can start building the case in general. The second thing that I then want to look at, or the third thing that we had on the agenda, was talking about arguments and responses. And this camera keeps doing weird things. So how do we generate arguments? And I think one of the questions that I received was about building arguments during an impromptu debate. I think the stuff on case construction is really useful insofar as you start framing the debate correctly and then arguments follow from that. What I'm going to look at primarily is what is the structure, or how do you structure an argument so that it's most compelling? And there are different ways in which you can do it. And I'm going to give you a brief overall structure, and then afterwards, and then afterwards I might do a couple of examples. So the way I like to have arguments is that the first thing that you would want to have in your argument is the general theme, of the argument, or the title that you're going to give your argument, or the idea of the argument itself. Then underneath that, you need to provide analysis. And then the third thing then becomes evidence, or examples, statistics, case studies. And then finally, you want to talk about impact. So who is affected by this, and why are those things necessarily good? Okay, so let's go through each of them. The first one, the idea of the argument. I think let's look at an example. So this house would abolish cosmetic surgery. So the first thing that you really want to say, or the one idea or argument that you could have for that particular topic is, cosmetic surgery supports unrealistic standards of beauty, or helps to perpetuate them. There, all you're giving is the idea behind the argument. Then the second thing that you would need to do is your analysis, and there are two parts to this. So the first part of the analysis is the sort of content material itself. why is the idea or the claim that you're making at the beginning of your statement true? So you can talk about how cosmetic surgery allows people to change their physical appearance. You talk about the predatory nature of cosmetic surgeons and how they provide promises to people, how they profit from ideas of beauty which are existing in society, and so on. So that's talking about the truth of the claim that you're making. Then the second part of the analysis is about why is this important? So why should I care about this particular thing? So in those instances, you are talking about how cosmetic surgery harms the women that are involved because they never learn to accept their beauty. You talk about how that it is essential for states, or not states, for governments to protect people who are often targeted by people with predatory practices and so on. So it's the why should I care bit. And then evidence is naturally statistics or examples. You can talk about the surge in cosmetic surgery that exists all around the world and so on. And then really impact doesn't exist in all arguments, but I think for some arguments it will be. So for example, in this instance, banning cosmetic surgery means that women are no longer exposed to these predatory practices. It also means that people are more likely to feel secure in themselves. People learn to accept their beauty without having a way out to simply just go under the knife. So there you're talking about the effects of this particular motion on different groups of people. And I think by identifying different actors, you can really add depth to your argument, because then you're able to have several layers of impact. And that does make it more nuanced, and judges definitely do appreciate that. So that's a general structure. If you're in a prep session, often people will come up with the argument that first comes to mind. And I guess the first thing when you're trying to construct those arguments and to achieve the structure is like, what am I ultimately trying to prove with this argument? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to achieve with this particular argument? And I think by doing that, by identifying the conclusion to the argument, the end point, the end game of that argument, you're then able to extract all of the analysis and layers of analysis that you're trying to achieve. So in prep, and when you're structuring the argument, a good approach to then have is to be conclusion driven. What am I trying to prove? What is the conclusion that I want to reach with this argument? And when you identify that first in prep, it's easier to then get the idea, extract the analysis, and talk about the actors. I think another good strategy as well is that you should probably identify the conclusion at the beginning of the argument. So for a lot of people will hear the word thesis and so on. So you might say, in a debate about the death penalty, is that I want to talk about, the first argument is about deterrence. And so the conclusion to this argument is that instituting the death penalty will deter criminals from committing crimes. So there you're clearly showing what the conclusion to the argument is. And I think there's a very clear advantage of identifying conclusions first, especially when you choose to deliver the argument, is that sometimes you might slip in steps of analysis, but judges have already identified the conclusion. So you might miss out on steps, but they know what you've tried to prove at the end of it. And so it's not lost in all of all of the mess that you ultimately end up having. Okay. One final thing is it's really important for you to identify how your argument interacts with the burdens that you have identified. So in case construction, I spoke about what the burdens are in proposition and opposition. I think it's really important for you to explicitly state this argument achieves X burden that we've established, and so we are winning on those metrics. Let's fix this lighting. It's not great having dark skin sometimes. So I hope that helps in terms of arguments. The second thing that's really important is responses to arguments. And I think this is something that I find to be a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Often we do not respond to arguments. And often we choose to, I guess, a big thing in BP that is allowed for is integrated rebuttal. And so that often bleeds into world schools. But I think it's really important to be responsive and to be explicitly responsive. So let's talk about rebuttal. I think I have a very particular take on this. You're more than welcome to ask other people. In your rebuttal, you should follow the following structure. The first thing is, tell me which argument you are responding to. A lot of people say, well, proposition is wrong for this reason, opposition is wrong for this reason, just citing reasons. But you become incredibly more compelling and also just clearer if you tell me, I am responding to their argument on government legitimacy. I'm responding to this particular argument. So making it very clear so that it's not this huge chunk of material. The second thing that you must do is tell me, why is this response to this particular argument important? And here we go, all of the lighting issues. So if you tell me why this response to this particular argument is important in terms of burdens, if I disprove that that the government deters crime through the death penalty, I reduce their impacts. They don't have the impacts on their sides. There you're giving me very clearly the strategic component of the rebuttal. Why is this rebuttal important? How does it impact their case, and how judges should be viewing that case? The third thing then becomes about, why is the argument wrong? So there you can do two things. You can either choose to say that their analysis is incorrect, and then you have to point to me, where is their analysis faulty, and why is it that they don't then reach that conclusion? That's one way of doing it. The second way you could do it is to say, well, it's not important. So in those instances, you're saying, well, the analysis might be true, but the argument itself has less value and importance, and here are the reasons why there is less value. Here are the reasons why there is less importance for the debate as a whole. So that's the way you ought to be framing that or structuring each piece of rebuttal. And I would suggest you do this for each individual issue that you are then provided with. And in world schools, there's often a burden to respond to all issues that have occurred in the debate. Excuse me. So you should respond to all issues that have occurred in the debate. And then the amount of time you spend responding to different issues depends on how important that issue is naturally. So if an issue isn't that important, you spend far less time on it compared to when an issue is important. So that's how I would then structure responses. If you choose to integrate, and this is something that's really important for BP as well, if you choose to do it, is that you should then tell me where is the material you are generating responding to their matter. So you can, as you're going through the speech, make it clear this part of the speech directly responds to this piece of material. Okay, so there is rebuttal. Now, the rebuttal I've focused on here is what is called offensive rebuttal. There you are attacking their arguments. But importantly, it's important to defend your own arguments. So here you have to do defensive rebuttal. And the structure would be the same. You have to tell me what issue are you dealing with. You need to tell me why this issue is important for burdens in the debate. You need to tell me what was the response and why is it that the response doesn't invalidate your arguments, or add analysis to deepen the arguments. And that way you really bolster up the arguments and ensure that it's still standing at the end of the debate. So as much as you do the offensive rebuttal, defensive rebuttal is also expected to happen. So then the fourth thing that was on the agenda was about strategy and how it interacts with content and style. And I know that a lot of, I think the interaction with content is the far more intuitive one. The interaction with style is not as intuitive, especially for people who come from formats of debating where style isn't explicitly graded, such as British parliamentary. So let's start. Content. Your content, in as far as it needs to be logical, it also needs to be consistent, and it also needs to be valuable and important to the debate. So there, the interaction with strategy is very clear. You want to ensure that your content and the material you're generating is important and pertinent to the debate. So you're going to be explaining that to us. That's where the strategy becomes important. You also need to ensure that it is consistent not only within your speech, but also across all the speeches of speakers on your teams. So there, if there are inconsistencies in content, it's also strategic inconsistency. So you don't want to be knifing or shafting, whatever language you choose to use, your teammates. The interaction with style is a little bit more, subtle and invisible to a lot of people. What we need to realize is that every single person that we are trying to persuade in a debate is a human being. And human beings, in as far as they are logical humans, and so need to understand, there's that component, they are also emotive human beings who can be persuaded emotively. So there's an important twofold interaction between strategy and style in this regard. The first part about understanding, right? Your choice of words, okay? Your choice of speed and tone can either reduce the understanding of judges or greatly enhance it. So that's important. So for example, if you choose to slow down where you are highlighting the most important conclusions and the most important content, that is a strategic decision that also is stylistic. You have strategically chosen that this part of my argument is important. And so I'm going to influence the style that I use. So I slow it right down so judges can hear what it is that I'm saying at that point in time. So that's one element. The second element that's important is then about emotiveness. Recognize we are all emotional human beings, whether you like it or not. So your choice, again, of tone, of speed, of language is then important insofar as that judges are able to resonate with the material generating. Really good example of this is I would say this comes from the World University Debating Championships. A lot of the finals do. But if you think about 2012 was Botswana. And so the PM speech there, problem analysis, talks about for over a decade how people have lived under the thumb of Robert Mugabe. And the language that was used and the numbers that were used were effective in establishing the sort of emotive appeal. You didn't just identify with this as from a knowledge perspective, you identified with it emotively. So it's very effective with that. Often you want judges to identify with the material and the content that you are generating. So that's the twofold way in which we do this. So how can we ensure that these things happen? Because that's always a question. Well, we can always talk about it in theory, but we're never sure of how to do this. I think the first thing is just watching debate videos and looking at the sort of language that's used for the purposes of clarity and the languages that is used for the purposes of emotive connection. So in terms of examples that you could look at, a lot of the world's finals are really good examples. So everyone will talk about world universities or world schools. So everyone will talk about Bose World University's final speech. That's good. Victor Finkel, PM, that's really good, from Botswana 2012. A couple of additionally really good speeches from world schools that I've seen. I think Singapore versus Pakistan in 2015, which is available on YouTube, and I can actually look for this link and post it here. That's a really good example where the Singaporean team really uses a lot of emotion to drive some of the, and rhetoric to drive some of the ideas home. And sometimes they're not fully proven, but you're able to emotionally identify with a lot of the issues that they generate. So those are a couple of examples, but if you look them up, that's good. I think the second thing is about reading and expanding your vocabulary. And that can have value in terms of clarity, because often we get stuck in our texts. So we'll say furthermore, moreover, all of the words which are very clearly text. But also we will not get the vocabulary right, or we won't use the most word efficient means of describing something. So for example, if we say, well, we need to weigh up that our policy could potentially have a significant detriment as opposed to our benefits, that's a long sentence for just talking about opportunity cost. So widening our vocabulary and also phrasing and understanding of issues can change the way in which we deliver a message so judges understand better, but it can also be advantageous because it means that we increase our word efficiency and make sure that we have more time available in our speeches. But also a wide vocabulary does necessarily mean that you're able to effectively emotively communicate. So for example, I'm not talking about how people are sad or things are bad in a particular place like Venezuela. You can very easily talk about starvation, and or for example, you can talk about now I'm forgetting words. In a war under a dictatorship, you talk about the slaughter of innocents. There, that changes how people emotively connect with the material, and that's useful. So wide vocabulary reading. So read news articles, read how people talk about it, read a novel, read books, listen to the phrasing that is used in some series. Emphasis on some, because often reading is also very useful. But also just talk about it with your coaches as well. I think the second thing is about practice. So don't just practice when you get a debate speech. Practice at home. Take 5 to 10 minutes each day to come up with a 2-minute speech where you are practicing this sort of thing. Record yourself. And often when we do record ourselves, we hear the worst in ourselves and sometimes the best. And that's useful because then you can correct it immediately. You're not waiting until a debate speech. You are actively listening to where your faults are. Where do you stutter? Where do you stammer? Am I varying the volume enough or the speed enough, especially when I get to the things that are most important? And that's also useful, useful if you're going to record yourself with a video. If you want to look at your hand gestures and your posture, because often we have really bad posture and weird ways of standing, and we have hand gestures which can be distracting. So, for example, the hand waving thing happens a lot. I know I'm guilty of it sometimes. So those are the ways in which you can practice. So please, questions, because we're now getting to the Q&A part of this. And I had 2 questions on the form, and I'm going to check if I received any other questions. The first question that I received was about building arguments, and I think I've addressed that somewhat, especially when you are under time pressure in impromptu rounds. I think a really important part of impromptu debates is how people choose to do prep. And I think people choose to do prep really wrong, because the first thing they do is they get the motion, they rush to the room, and then they start throwing out ideas. And it's a personal choice, I guess, but it's also important to understand that you need a little bit of time to calm down after you've received the motion. You also need a little bit of time to just think before you throw out ideas. So the first thing that you should probably do when you go into a prep session isn't throw out ideas, is actually talking about the strategic prep. So what is this motion about? Are there any examples that we can discuss? And then that will be very useful in that regard. Then you should go into silent prep. Spend 5, 10, 12 minutes individually thinking, what do you think the issues are in this debate? And spend time to think about them. Don't just throw out ideas, because often what happens is someone generates an idea. Oh, I've just thought of something, but now I've forgotten it. So spend time to think, write it down. And then you can go into the discussion of ideas, and that will help you with your building of arguments. Follow the strategies that have been discussed. Okay. Then the second question was about the differences between world schools and BP. And there are several differences. I'm not sure if I'll be able to cover them all. I think for me, the most important difference is generally about the weighing of the different components of persuasiveness: content, style, strategy. Now in BP, it's less explicit. And also there are differing schools of thought in BP. But in general, it's said that the general understanding is that content and strategy are more important, or weighed more importantly and more heavily, and that style is only meaningful insofar as it enhances or detracts from the persuasiveness of the arguments themselves. That's different in terms of world schools, because in world schools, what we see is that content and style weigh more heavily, having 40% each. And style is important independently of the other arguments. And so of the other components. So yes, it influences the other components, but the other components also influence each other. But style should be credited on its own, and it should be treated as something that's valuable and important, because in world schools, the general philosophy is if we wanted to have really great content and strategy, we'd read your speeches. But we also want really good style and your ability to connect with your adjudicators, and so that's important. That's the first difference. I think the second difference is just in terms of relative speaker roles, because in world schools, or in BP, you have 4 teams of 2 people. In world schools, you have 2 teams of 3 people, and the expectations are different. So broadly speaking, Prop 1 and the Prime Minister are the same. Op 1 and the Leader of Opposition are the same. Prop 2 and the Deputy Prime Minister are the same. Op 2 and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition are also the same. The differences then becomes in the later half. In world schools, Prop 3 and Op 3 are purely responsive speakers. So they only do rebuttal. They can bring in substantive material that can be credited on condition that it was signposted in the first speech. That is generally a strategy which is frowned upon and should never be, basically never followed. The second thing that is different is that the reply speakers can only be, speeches are only delivered by first or second speakers. And secondly, the other thing is that they are purely summary speeches. So they aren't allowed to have new arguments. They aren't allowed to have new rebuttal. They can have new examples, but that's about it. The third speeches are allowed to have new rebuttal and new examples, but basically no new arguments unless it's been signposted. And even then, that's a very risky strategy. It's different because in BP, the member speeches are expected to have new rebuttal and new arguments in general, unless they're doing analytical extensions. And then the whip speakers are expected to have new rebuttal and summarize the debate and so on. In world schools, the reply speech is only a summary speech. It doesn't do anything else outside of that. Yeah, so I think that's it. And I've received no additional questions, unfortunately, but I hope this has all helped and you've all found it useful. And I look forward to seeing everyone in Poland in a few weeks. Yeah, and prepared motions will be announced later on today. So thank you very much for those who listened and for those who will end up listening later on. I hope you have found this useful. If you ever need to communicate or ask me any questions, you can find me on Facebook. You can also look for my email address and I'll happily respond to them. Okay, thank you very much and have a fantastic Sunday.